Good afternoon, everyone. It's loud. If you could all please take your seats, we're going to get started. Welcome to a full spectrum future, smart policy for America's airwaves. My name is Tom Schatz. I am the president of Citizens Against Government Waste. We're very pleased to co-host this event with New America's Open Technology Institute and WifiForward. Michael Calabrese, who is the director of the Open Technology Institute's Wireless Future Project, will be moderating the discussion after the chairman's remarks. As you know, spectrum can't be seen, touched, smelled, or tasted, yet it is vital, valuable, and limited in availability. As the U.S. continues to innovate with new devices, applications, and networks, spectrum, both licensed and unlicensed, is a critical resource that enables fast and reliable communications that will help make the future possible and better. Using the combination of licensed and unlicensed spectrum will allow broadband and technology providers to fully realize the potential of 5G technology and provide connectivity for countless devices used by American consumers and businesses. Today, we will be looking at the unlicensed use of spectrum for Wi-Fi in the 5.9 and 6 gigahertz bands, along with whatever else Chairman Pai wishes to talk about. And before our panel begins, I would like to introduce our special guest. FCC Chairman Ajit Pai has been a strong proponent of moving the U.S. forward in deploying next-generation 5G networks, bridging the digital divide between rural and urban America, and battling against the incursion of Chinese technology within U.S. networks. He has fought to eliminate waste, fraud, abuse in federal programs, demanding an end to corporate welfare in a recent major spectrum auction, and leading a much-needed investigation into the Lifeline program. As chairman, he increased transparency by publishing agenda items before the commission 2 weeks prior to the monthly meetings, which of course means before them no one knew what was going on until after they met, and also increasing economic evaluation of proceedings by reinstituting the Office of Economic Analysis. That helps subject the FCC's rulemaking process to a cost-benefit scrutiny to better inform commissioners of the projected impact of a proposed rule. His regulatory philosophy is, and I quote, "The FCC is at its best when it proceeds on the basis of consensus. Good communications policy knows no partisan affiliation." It has been very refreshing to work with Chairman Pai, and I welcome him to the podium. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, for that very kind introduction. Thanks to everyone for coming out for a lunchtime discussion about the future of AM radio. No, I'm just kidding. I know this crowd knows that the real action is here to talk about mid-band spectrum. I also want to thank the co-sponsors of today's discussion, Citizens Against Government Waste, New America's Open Technology Institute, and WifiForward. Thank you as well to whoever came up with a backdrop that very conveniently matches my sartorial color scheme. And thank you as well to the FCC staff who are working hard each and every day to make sure that spectrum is put to its highest valued use. Most notably, the legendary head of our Office of Engineering and Technology, Mr. Julie Knapp, who joins us here today. I'd like to begin my remarks by talking about the one thing in Washington that may be more beloved than even Julie, and that is the 2019 World Series champion Washington Nationals. Now, I start with the Nats for two reasons. One, as indicated by your applause, it's always smart to pander to one's audience. But secondly, and more importantly, I do think that the Nats are an excellent metaphor for the 5.9 gigahertz band, and let me explain why that is. After years of disappointment, the front office of the Nats chose a new path. Instead of staying the course and re-signing Bryce Harper, they let him walk. They gave his slot in the lineup to teenage phenom Juan Soto and reallocated some of Harper's salary to sign pitcher Patrick Corbin. As we all know now, Mr. Corbin was the winning pitcher in Game 7 of the World Series. Mr. Soto blossomed into a star, and of course the Nats won it all. Now, this is essentially the winning formula that the FCC seeks to replicate with the 5.9 gigahertz band. We want to move on from something we've tried for a long time that wasn't working and open the door to new and exciting opportunities. Let me elaborate. Back in 1999, for those of you who don't know, the FCC allocated some 75 megahertz of spectrum in the 5.9 gigahertz band to a service called Dedicated Short-Range Communications, or DSRC. Now, DSRC was intended to enable ubiquitous transportation and vehicle-related communications. But the results haven't matched that intent. Here we are 2 decades later, and the situation can be, at best, described as promise unfulfilled. DSRC has evolved slowly. It is not widely deployed. And in the meantime, a wave of transportation communication technologies has emerged. As a result, a lot of people are wondering whether this valuable spectrum, a public resource, is really being put to its best use. In my view, it clearly is not. After 20 years of seeing these prime airwaves go largely unused, the time has come for the FCC to take a fresh look at the 5.9 gigahertz band. And I'm pleased to announce that today I shared with my FCC colleagues a proposal to end uncertainty around the 5.9 gigahertz band and set a path for the deployment of new services. Specifically, I'm proposing to make available the lower 45 megahertz of the band for unlicensed uses like Wi-Fi, and the upper 20 megahertz for a new automotive communications technology called Cellular Vehicle to Everything, or CV2X. I'm also proposing that we seek public input on whether to allocate the remaining 10 megahertz in that band to CV2X or DSRC. The FCC will vote on this notice of proposed rulemaking at our December 12th meeting. Now let me go into a little more detail on what we're proposing, starting with unlicensed uses. DSRC's lack of progress over the past 20 years becomes even starker when you consider that 1999 also marked the birth of Wi-Fi. Since its launch, as all of you know, if you have a smartphone, Wi-Fi has become a staple in our everyday lives. It binds together our phones and laptops and other connected devices. It's become a foundational technology for the Internet of Things, connecting our TVs, thermostats, baby monitors, refrigerators, washing machines, toys, and even toilets. It drives basic consumer decisions, like whether and where to book a hotel room. Small wonder that a survey a few years ago found that over 40% of consumer respondents said that Wi-Fi was more important to them on a daily basis than chocolate, alcohol, and what I will call intimate relations. Wi-Fi now carries more than half of the internet's traffic. It has arguably kept cellular networks afloat by reducing the traffic load on those networks. But Wi-Fi's popularity has raised a challenge for regulators like me. We need to make more spectrum available for unlicensed use. Indeed, to meet growing consumer demand, it has been estimated that the US will need to allow unlicensed use of up to 1.6 gigahertz of new mid-band spectrum by 2025. Well, the FCC hears this call. Last October, we began to explore opening up a massive 1,200 megahertz of spectrum in the 6 gigahertz band for different types of unlicensed uses. And, as I mentioned, today I'm proposing to permit unlicensed operations in the lower 45 megahertz portion of the 5.9 gigahertz band. Now, thanks to its neighbor, this spectrum punches above its weight, so to speak. The adjacent 5.725 to 5.85 gigahertz band is currently available for unlicensed operations, making this 45 megahertz subband ideally suited for unlicensed use. Now, having more contiguous spectrum here is essential for the larger channels needed to support innovative use cases of the future. Now, it's important to note that my proposal marks a departure from our recent exploration of allowing unlicensed devices to share the same spectrum with DSRC. Preliminary testing of a sharing regime showed some promise, but further testing would be needed to carry out a complex sharing regime, and more testing means that this valuable spectrum would likely lie fallow for several more years. As it is, this valuable mid-band spectrum has been lying largely fallow for 2 decades. We are well past the point when American consumers should accept significant additional delays in putting this spectrum to work for them. And it's not just that sharing spectrum between unlicensed uses and DSRC would take time. It also adds complexity, and it raises the question of whether, given its past, DSRC is a technology with a future. And that is why I believe the best course is to dedicate 45 megahertz exclusively for unlicensed operations, and also to establish a home exclusively for transportation-related communications. And that brings me to the second half of my proposal. dedicating 30 megahertz of spectrum in the 5.9 gigahertz band for intelligent transportation systems. Now, stepping back from the trees to the forest, the FCC has long been a supporter of innovation in the transportation sector. A keyless entry and tire pressure monitors, anti-theft systems, and security services, just to name a few. These are all technologies that have been enabled by FCC decisions over the years. And during my tenure in particular, automotive safety has been a priority. Back in 2017, I led an effort to allocate a large swath of contiguous spectrum in the 76 to 81 gigahertz band exclusively for vehicular radars. And these radars have proved especially useful for emergency braking and adaptive cruise control. The improvements in transportation technology that we have enabled demonstrate that many of the features originally envisioned for DSRC are being provided today by other means. Applications like Waze help with traffic management and provide alerts far in advance of road hazards lying ahead. Blind spot detection and lane departure warnings have become common features on the latest cars. And one promising new technology that is gaining momentum in the automotive industry is C-V2X. C-V2X would use standard cellular protocols to provide direct communications between vehicles and, as the name suggests, everything, including other vehicles on the road, infrastructure like light poles, cyclists like me, pedestrians, as well as road workers. C-V2X would also support new advanced applications as we transition to faster, more responsive 5G networks. And it is backed by automakers like Ford, Audi, BMW, Daimler, and Tesla. And here's one more thing that's important to know about C-V2X. It is incompatible with DSRC-based operations. Now, based on the evidence in the public record, I believe that we should encourage the expansion and evolution of this new vehicle safety technology. And that's why I'm proposing that we authorize C-V2X operations in the upper 20 megahertz of the 5.9 gigahertz band. Our hope is that this move will unlock new vehicle safety services using less spectrum and on a much faster timeline than we have seen or realistically will see with the DSRC-focused policy. Now, just because we're changing course and prioritizing C-V2X technology doesn't mean we're closing the door on DSRC entirely. Even after 20 years, we are once again being told that DSRC technology is about to take off. Japan, for example, has a single 10 megahertz channel for DSRC that is actively used for collision avoidance around intersections. So I'm proposing that we seek public input on whether to allocate the remaining 10 megahertz of spectrum in the 5.9 gigahertz band for DSRC or C-V2X. Advocates of each will have a fair chance to be able to make their case to the FCC and to the American public. Now, this balanced approach makes one thing absolutely clear. The FCC is committed to automotive safety. The Commission will no longer tolerate automotive safety and spectrum allocation policies that are not delivering significant results for American consumers. We are focused on forward-looking spectrum policies to make our transportation network safer and more efficient, including policies for the 5.9 gigahertz band. So moving forward, let's resist and reject the notion that we have to choose between automotive safety and Wi-Fi. My proposal would do far more for both automotive safety and Wi-Fi than the status quo. Now, of course, as those in this room know, this is the beginning, not the end, of the FCC's rulemaking process. We're seeking public comment on my proposal, and we will make our final decisions based on the facts that we collect in our record. But there are already some things that we can say for certain. As my fellow commissioners have noted in public statements, and as most reasonable observers confirm, the policy we have had in place since 1999 has not maximized the value of the 5.9 gigahertz band for the American consumer. After 4 presidential administrations, 8 FCC chairs, and 20 years, it is long past time to turn the page. Let's move on from our failed strategy, let's look to the future, and let's score a major victory for the American people. If the Washington Nationals can do it, so can the FCC. Thank you very much.
if we can hear me better. Just to say, wanted to thank Chairman Pai for announcing this good news here today, and I think it's really fair to say that this FCC, if its proposals are finalized, will, far and away have opened up more unlicensed spectrum and done more for Wi-Fi to help consumers than any commission in history. So this has really been a commission that's championed unlicensed spectrum and recognized that it has to keep pace in a 5G world if we're all going to benefit. So with that, I wanted to actually, we'll start here with the panel that provide just a little bit of context to what the chairman said in terms of why this down payment on contiguous wide channels for Wi-Fi is so important. We've all heard, I think, over and over that 5G wireless networks are characterized by much higher throughput, by very low latency, less than 5 milliseconds, and by the ability to connect a huge number of devices, not just smartphones, but everything in your connected home or office. The Internet of Things connectivity by itself is a real game changer. What you'll hear today is that next-gen Wi-Fi networks have all of these 5G capabilities, gigabit fast, low latency, able to connect hundreds of devices, but they'll be available very quickly to all Americans. Today, unlicensed Wi-Fi is an essential complement to licensed mobile 4G networks. Most consumers don't even realize that 70 to 80% of their mobile device data traffic is being carried over Wi-Fi and never touches mobile carrier spectrum or mobile carrier networks. That's for mobility, that's when you're out and about. But 80% of traffic is indoors, increasingly video, and almost always Wi-Fi. And just as Wi-Fi is central to today's 4G wireless ecosystem, next-gen Wi-Fi will be a complement that makes 5G services readily available and more affordable to every home, school, business, nationwide, and not just in urban areas where there's high revenue to make, but anywhere where there's some sort of fixed broadband backhaul. So today we heard Chairman Pai announce the first big step, adding an additional 160 megahertz channel, which is made possible by segmenting that lower 45 megahertz of the 5.9 band. And from our panel, you hear why the FCC's efforts to open more unlicensed spectrum, not only at 5.9, but then immediately above it across the entire 6 gigahertz band, more than 1,200 megahertz of new unlicensed spectrum capacity, is key to unlocking the potential for the US to truly have the world's most robust and equitable 5G wireless networks. So I hope that sets the stage a bit for those of you who haven't been following this terribly closely.
Why don't people follow it so closely, Michael?
And let me start off with by asking each of you, by way of introduction, because the bios are on the, everyone's bios on the back of the handout you all have, so I'm not going to burn a lot of time with your backgrounds. But starting with Deb Collier, who is the Director of Technology and Telecom Policy at Citizens Against Government Waste. Let me just ask kind of an initial question and get us rolling. So Citizens Against Government Waste seeks to, of course, good name, very literal name, right?
Right.
Because you seek to identify and eliminate waste in government.
Wasteful spending.
So where are you seeing waste in our spectrum policy, and why has CAGW called for the agency to take a fresh look at reallocating this 5.9 gigahertz band?
Right. Well, as the chairman alluded to, spectrum, because it's such a valuable resource, to see spectrum for 20 years lay fallow and not really be utilized to its fullest potential, that is wasteful. And so having the this announcement today is awesome, in my personal opinion, just because having that second look at this particular, the 5.9 gigahertz band, having that second look is really going to, I think, make people aware that there are areas in spectrum where there is waste. It's just sitting and it's not being used. And spectrum can be used for various purposes, not just licensed spectrum for, mobile communications, but also the unlicensed use. And with the increasing number of devices that we have, there is going to be a strain on the unlicensed use. So this, the announcement today is really a good announcement, knowing that the FCC is going to take that additional look.
Next, I would ask Ian Adams, if you could, say a bit about your role at Tech Freedom and also Tech Freedom's perspective on what Chairman Pai announced today. How do you see this good, bad, otherwise?
Well, I think it's fair to say it's good. On? Is that on now?
No, yours is on. You can
Mine's
use
on.
mine.
Great. Okay, so my name's Ian Adams. I work for a technology think tank and know how to operate a microphone as a result of that. No, we think this is a really positive development today. We work a lot on the future of transportation, and we think that this announcement actually does a lot for safety insofar as it gives a firm grounding to C-V2X while still potentially maintaining room for another technology that has been a focus for a long time, DSRC. And I think what it does is it shows the FCC's commitment moving forward by removing a lot of uncertainty in this area, while also recognizing what has been underutilization of some really valuable spectrum. You look at where automotive development is going, and you look at where automotive safety is going. We talk a lot about automated vehicles, and we talk a lot about the fleet as we have it now in this country. The average age of a vehicle on America's roads is 11 years old. It takes a long time for that fleet to turn over. And the thing about DSRC, while it may have promise, it requires a lot of vehicles on the road to have that technology. We simply haven't seen that. And so today is a recognition of that reality. And for that reason, it's a good thing.
Okay, thanks. Next, we have Ellen Satterwhite, who is Vice President of the Glen Echo Group, but also in today primarily as a policy fellow at the American Library Association. So Ellen, why is this?
Why do libraries care?
Why does this matter to libraries, schools, and community anchor institutions?
Well, thank you, Michael. And first, I want to thank the chairman for his announcement today, because I don't know if many of you caught this weekend or last week, the Wall Street Journal had an article on those being left behind by our broadband future. And the big picture, it's a dark picture, and there is an older woman and a young man, and their faces are lit up by a screen, and they're in a car. And the caption says that it's a grandmother and her grandson in the parking lot of their local library using the Wi-Fi after hours for him to do his homework. So we've heard those tales, and I think libraries provide many critical resources to their communities, but they are, for so many people, the on-ramp to the internet and the way to connect the unconnected. So the chairman's move today is sort of an immediate step forward in helping to close the digital divide. And I think not just for libraries, but for other community anchor institutions, putting a public face on what better Wi-Fi means improved healthcare outcomes, right? It means that the Wi-Fi that our airports use to keep us safe for baggage handling and all those things, it's an important step forward, and we're really looking forward to what the chairman has said he would like to do in unlicensed.
Okay. And then our final panelist, Louis Peretz, who is Vice President for Policy at the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association. So Louis, when it comes to Wi-Fi, I think most folks think about getting connected at the airport, at the library, Starbucks, or streaming video in their bedroom at night. So I'm wondering is why do your members, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your membership and why they care so much about opening large contiguous blocks of unlicensed spectrum?
Okay, thank you, Michael, for the question. Can you hear me? I can hear myself. This will help me gauge how much information I should tell you about the WISP industry. How many folks in the room, with a show of hands, know that there's a fixed wireless internet service provider in DC that can offer you service? Oh, Steve, you don't count. Steve already knows who that. So DC Access, and they provide service speeds, download speeds, and upload speeds that rival some of the other folks in the room here. Hi, Elizabeth. And are you from Brian? Are you from Comcast, right? Yes. So those folks. We have over 800 members that are members of WISPA. 557 of them are actual wireless internet service providers, and the vast majority of them, 70%, are very rugged small businesses, meaning that 70% have 10 or fewer employees, and 70% have 2,000 or fewer subscribers. And there's over 2,000 WISPs all over America, and those 2,000 WISPs are actually providing service to 6 million rural Americans. So this is why you've heard Chairman Pai say that we are sort of the foot soldiers of the battle to bridge digital divides, and I do think when you meet these companies and know more about them, you'll see that the compliments are well earned, okay? And a month ago, we had our annual show, WISPAPalooza, and I got to meet a lot of them. And these folks, you know, they have sort of a blue-collar edge to them that they wear quite proudly and for good reason. They're plain-spoken. They have an attitude that says there's no task too difficult and no task too trivial for them to pursue in order to be successful. And they are hell-bent on being successful. And they're very intelligent, and they know what's going on in DC. And so when they tell me that, you know, we need a lot more unlicensed spectrum because 2.4 is congested, is heavily congested, 5 gigahertz, the current bands allocated for Wi-Fi is congested, I listen to them and I believe them. And this 45 megahertz that that Chairman Pai has signaled would be allocated for unlicensed use is going to be a huge help to bridging digital divides in rural areas. So Evan, if you're listening, please tell Chairman Pai WISPA really thanks him today. But to Michael's broader point, what is really exciting, and the devil will be in the details, we need to actually take a look at the technical rules, because what's really important to WISPA, so that we drive the equipment manufacturing ecosystem for wireless devices, is that technical rules allow for higher power use, and now I'm talking about 6 gigahertz, okay? Higher power use in both rural and urban areas, okay? But then, and to actually take advantage of all of the emerging technologies that will be available on Wi-Fi 6, we actually need the contiguous spectrum and 160 megahertz of contiguous spectrum that the chairman was describing today.
Okay, thanks, Willie. So I guess I'll start with, you know, and I'll ask some questions, but then, you know, please be thinking of your own questions or comments, you know, a bit later on.
No comments, just questions.
Only positive comments now. But you know, this is really kind of for all of you, but I'm going to look first at Ellen and then probably for Willie to do maybe a more particular follow-up on what he just said. Is, you know, we've heard endlessly about 5G from the perspective of the big mobile carriers, you know, kind of their vision of it, network slicing and the whole bit. So, so looking forward now to a 5G wireless ecosystem, what is the role of unlicensed spectrum in the next generation of wireless networks? You know, is it likewise, you know, like 5G compared to 4G, a big leap forward? And what is, you know, in terms of speed, latency, utility? I mentioned that at the outset, but what does that actually mean in practical terms for places, you know, like schools and libraries, and like the sort of services that WISPs are delivering, and otherwise, you know, for the public consumers in general? So.
Yeah, good question. And I think Tom laid it out pretty well in what he said in his opening remarks, but 5G connectivity will require a sufficient amount of licensed and unlicensed. And in fact, the way that most consumers will experience 5G speeds, low latency, many, many connections, just blazing fast speeds both up and down, the way they'll experience those connections is indoors via Wi-Fi. And the just announced and just kind of entering the marketplace new standard for Wi-Fi, Wi-Fi 6, is really built for that. So when you talk about, you know, from 3G to 4G, we were really talking about, oh, it's a step function increase in speeds. Well, from 4G to 5G will not just be speeds, but it's latency, it's experience, it's also optimizing for many, 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 many connected devices. And that's what this new standard of Wi-Fi is built for. It's really optimized for environments like libraries and schools and venues and offices that have a ton of devices connecting and competing for bandwidth. Wi-Fi 6 actually borrows some really good things from the cellular world so that the spectrum can be used more efficiently, carry more data, and provide consumers the experience that they're looking for. Not just at home, not just, you know, in a digitally ready school or a library, but also, as I mentioned, in hospitals, at airports, at ports, you know, all of these places where it's very important that connected devices actually connect. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. I can talk about 160 megahertz channels and how excited we are too.
I may ask you again more, you know, later about some of the cool things that schools could do with it.
Yeah.
Louis?
Yeah, so I think what most people think of Wi-Fi in this room, those who have fortunate enough to have cable or Verizon Fios or something like that, is, you know, Wi-Fi in their home comes on after you come into the house and you want to connect your tablets and your kids' tablets and smartphones and things of that nature. But for our members and the communities that they serve, unlicensed is largely it. That's 90% of our members are using unlicensed for backhaul and using unlicensed for access to the premises, whether it be a residence or a business. So, you know, when we get to 6 gigahertz, that will be amazing for our members, because the kind of high speed, high bandwidth, low latency applications that everyone is talking about and really eager and looking forward to, that Wi-Fi 6 can enable, that's not going to come to rural America, sparsely populated rural America, until we really have 1,200 megahertz of spectrum allocated via in the 6 gigahertz band. And you know, I've really only been on the job not even quite 4 months, but I've visited an awful lot of WISP, particularly in sparsely populated rural areas. How many folks have been to Montana? Oh, good, a fair number of the room. I mean, it's a beautiful country, but my goodness, is it rural, right? And it's like you have shopping centers. More cows. Well, okay. I didn't even see the cows.
There's cattle.
Oh, cattle.
They don't call them cows.
Yeah, I mean, there's real cowboys in Montana, that's for sure. But in any event, I mean, you have like these towns, and really probably nothing more than 2,000 or 3,000 people, and then you drive another 60 miles at 80 miles an hour, I might add. I mean, that's fun. And then you get to another town of like 2,000 people. And in those towns, you know, I drove around a little bit, and I didn't see hospitals, right? And everybody knows about how rural hospitals are shrinking nationwide, but I mean, what they have is these little health clinics, much smaller than this space right here. And they're gonna need all of the super connectivity, telemedicine type stuff that's coming from GE Healthcare and others who are working really hard on healthcare connectivity. So that's gonna be really important to the communities that WISPA members serve.
Okay.
Michael, can I,
Yeah, go ahead.
a thought that just occurred to me as Louis was talking too, I think what's so critical about 5.9 and the move that the chairman has announced today, or that the FCC is considering, is the speed with which libraries and schools and our homes can experience that upgrade in connectivity, right? So that 160 megahertz channel, many routers on the market today, particularly enterprise routers, with what is a little more complicated than a software upgrade, can then take advantage of those 160, that first ever 160 megahertz channel and improve connectivity. Like, we're talking, you know, when we talk about some of the moves in licensed spectrum, we're talking about 3 to 7 years, and we won't get into that, but this could happen immediately, and I think that's why unlicensed is so exciting and important, particularly for our community anchor institutions.
So Alan, let me actually, this may save time because I had a question coming up.
Oh, great.
That was getting at that, which is, you know, we hear a lot about how, you know, again, you know, primarily from the mobile carriers, about how low, mid-band, and high-band spectrum is all important, you know, for 5G, that they need all of it, more of all of it. And so we've been arguing about this. I mean, 45 megahertz doesn't sound like a whole lot of spectrum compared to the need for, you know, very wide channels for 5G capable services. So why is this particular spectrum important? Like, you know, where it's located?
Yeah.
You're getting at that.
Yeah.
Just want you to finish.
Thank you for leading me to the. So I had never used the word contiguous more in my life than in the last 3 years. But it really is important. So the most widely used Wi-Fi band today, the workhorse of Wi-Fi, like where all of that traffic, most of that traffic is flowing, is what's called the Uni 3 band. And the 45 megahertz that the chairman, the 45 megahertz of additional spectrum that the chairman is proposing is right next to that. So you go from, you know, the thinner channel to a wider channel, and it needs to be contiguous, and that immediately opens up additional bandwidth and additional applications. Did I get there?
That's right.
Okay.
And it's
Correct.
and it's exactly an extension of the existing 5 gigahertz.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
very close to 6.
And very close to 6, which is, you know, I think when we're talking about making the best and highest use of the spectrum that we have available, you know, first I think this move in 5.9 is a great move because the worst spectrum is unused spectrum, right? It is, or underused spectrum. And so the FCC has a tough job making those determinations, and it's clear that they have really looked at the public interest benefits. And I should say, you know, Commissioners O'Reilly and Rosenworcel have been extremely supportive and kind of beating the drum about this together, that making the most and effective use of that spectrum is important.
Okay. And if there's any other comment on this, otherwise, I'm going to go back to Deb and Ian right now, in particular, but everybody should chime in about the 5.9 and how that played out over time. So the chairman, I couldn't help chuckling a bit. He mentioned that that both DSRC, you know, which is dedicated short-range communications, a standard that the FCC imposed on the ITS band. The DSRC and Wi-Fi are both celebrating their 20th anniversary this year. Yay, DSRC. So, so, so FCC mandated that auto safety standard, a very specific, standard, DSRC 20 years ago. I guess if you could say a bit more about, probably both of you in turn, like, how has that turned out, and what lessons, can we take from that? Particularly if you also look not only back but forward to the fact that we'll soon, hopefully, have 5G general purpose networks that are blazing fast.
Yeah, DSRC technology, as far as automobiles, really has not taken off. It is used for truck platooning. I believe they use it a lot for truck platooning in Europe. And there are some applications for truck platooning here in the US as well. However, for the general automotive industry, it's really not taken off. There was one vehicle on the road that was deployed by General Motors, one model of vehicle that was deployed. And then Toyota was talking about deploying some vehicles in 2021 or 2023, somewhere in there. But the technology really has not taken off for vehicle safety. Instead, what we've come up with are other, as Chairman Pai alluded to earlier, other technologies such as, our cameras that we've got on our cars that allow us to see what's going on around our vehicles, radar, LiDAR. There's ongoing development in auto safety. And the auto industry is constantly innovating and finding new technologies that are not reliant on 5.9 for automotive safety. And they're doing a great job at deploying these new technologies. But meanwhile, we've had this spectrum for 20 years that in order for any new technology to even be considered using this spectrum, you have to go and you have to ask for a waiver from the FCC because it's only for DSRC. And that really pigeonholed that whole 75 megahertz of spectrum. So by splitting the spectrum up, as the chairman's indicated, it allows for continued use of DSRC by those industries that are using it. It allows for the exploration of CV to X, and it adds additional unlicensed spectrum right next to the uniband that can be used for Wi-Fi.
So I agree with Deb. Building cars is hard. It's an industry with relatively low margins. The time horizon for development is quite long. So I think that showing patience to this point has probably made sense. But this is an experiment that we've tried for quite some time now. There are competing uses. I love the idea that it's since 1999 that we've had DSRC along with Wi-Fi, and they've taken very different paths. And I don't think there's anything wrong with saying on the one hand, safety is vital. It is absolutely vital. Tens of thousands of people are killed every year on America's roads, but the answer isn't going to be DSRC. The answer is going to be the great work that automakers are doing with highly automated vehicles and with CV to X and other supplementary systems that these vehicles are going to have, because I simply don't believe you will see the level of market penetration necessary to make DSRC effective from a safety perspective. So I'm very excited about what the future holds for safety in the automotive context. Those tens of thousands of deaths and countless injuries that we have every single year, they're still at the very forefront of this proposal. And I think accommodating greater safety is clearly on the chairman's mind and the FCC's.
Yeah. As a quick follow-up, I mean, do you think, it seems to me that, you could comment on this, part of the context here that hasn't been mentioned is that the previous administration was actually had a notice of rulemaking for, I guess what I call the Obama talking car mandate. It was to require DSRC in every new car, which would have cost something on the order of $100 billion. over 20 years, and the Trump administration has shelved that mandate. Meanwhile, Europe has set aside this same 30 megahertz that Chairman Pai is proposing for DSRC and C-V2X to have at it. No mandate in the EU either. So, I mean, do you think that's part of kind of the context in which the chairman felt comfortable moving ahead here and in proposing this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think there's a recognition that there are alternative technologies out there that can achieve much the same outcome and much the same promise that we were talking about back in 1999, and can do so without levying just enormous costs on American consumers. I think it accomplishes all of those things.
And if I might add, the one thing about DSRC is that it requires all the vehicles to have the technology installed. So that means that, say, somebody's driving a 1965 Oldsmobile, and they love their 1965 Oldsmobile, great car. And so they're driving down the road. The cars that have the DSRC technology in them aren't necessarily going to recognize this object. Whereas you've got the cameras, they'll see the car, you've got the radar, the LiDAR, all the other technology. They're going to recognize that there's a vehicle on the road that may not be recognized by DSRC technology. And the only way for it to be recognized is for an aftermarket purchase and installation of the technology.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in the report that we put out 3 years ago, one of the quotes that stood out was from, NHTSA, the DOT's own study and notice of rulemaking on this, was that the agency would not know if DSRC would be effective for 15 to 25 years until almost all the fleet turned over. So it's certainly a great safety technology, is probably icing on the automated vehicle cake at some point, but even NHTSA was only requiring really a 10 megahertz safety signaling channel and not 75 megahertz. So let me ask, to get even a little more forward-looking and provocative, I guess ask you two again, and all four of you. Commission. Yes, so I must be looking at Deb, right? Commissioner O'Reilly has suggested that as part of a fresh look at the allocation of this band, that the FCC might consider moving auto safety signaling to a different band, perhaps even a better band. He mentioned, for example, that the 4.9 gigahertz public safety band is only 3% occupied. In fact, the Commission has an open proceeding because they're struggling to find some way to put it to use. And yet it's difficult to take that away from public safeties. So, our coalition has said that would be a win-win for consumers, to think about just moving it so that you talk about contiguous, right? You have all through 5 to 6 gigahertz for Wi-Fi and other unlicensed services. So is that an option that the Commission should at least consider at this point? I mean, how far along is C-V2X? Is it, is it at a point where it could look at different frequencies?
You don't want to take this, huh?
Michael, why don't you answer the question?
No, it's, once again, 4.9 is another area of spectrum that is underutilized, but it is specified for public safety. So you have to consider its existing use. Will we be expanding that use for public safety? Or, there's a lot of questions that I have internally about, whether or not moving automotive safety into that band would be a good idea. So, it's something that...
Band. I just don't have another one on top of my head.
Right, but it is something that I think does need to be looked at as part of this whole discussion about automotive safety and public safety and where those can meet for the public good.
I'd like to say something.
Oh, yeah. I should jump in.
Say something provocative, Louis.
Well, I'm a big fan. I agree with If Commissioner O'Reilly is saying move them to 4.9 so that,
Well, he didn't say that specifically. He just said,
Okay.
maybe we should look at whether moving them could be a bigger win-win, and
Yeah.
noted at the same time that 4.9 is very underutilized.
is Evan still here? No. WISPA would strongly support that proposal. Because, I mean, it just opens up more spectrum for faster services for all the reasons that Ellen was so eloquent in describing earlier.
Okay. Anything else, Ian? No? All right. Let me ask Ellen, I guess a little more generally about the role. You know, Louis mentioned Wi-Fi, well, not Wi-Fi per se, right? But his members use unlicensed spectrum to help bridge the rural digital divide, because it's open access, free spectrum that can be used for fixed wireless in places where it's too expensive to string wire, right? But looking at it a little more broadly, how can better Wi-Fi, this next generation of Wi-Fi, help bridge the digital divide more generally? Because we have lots of folks who are broadband deprived even in our inner cities.
Yeah, it's a good question, Michael, and I think so Dr. Raoul Katz has done some research for WifiForward, and John Horrigan did a survey for WifiForward a while ago about how Wi-Fi is an important on-ramp for consumers, particularly because of cost concerns. So not the backhaul cost concerns that Louis is talking about, but that as mobile consumers, we've all become very smart about when we're on Wi-Fi and when we're on a data connection that might cost us something, right? And many of us turn our phones automatically to find and sense the Wi-Fi connection. But you know, I'll put it this way: I go to shout out to the Woodridge Public Library in the District of Columbia. It's my local library. It's always packed. And you know, it has a full computer lab. It has a computer lab for teens. These are wired connections. But what you can also do is bring your own device, and you can print. You can fill things out from your mobile device and then get them, you know, transferred to a computer, all using the Wi-Fi connection there at the library. The same concept of bring your own device translates to schools, and you know, there's now this concept out of North Carolina and a number of schools, and John Windhausen will correct me if I'm wrong. John Windhausen, Executive Director of the Shelby Coalition, and Shelby's been very active on this issue as well. But there's the concept of digitally, like Wi-Fi ready for digital learning. So it's not enough anymore to have Wi-Fi to your school. That Wi-Fi has to have the capacity to handle at least one device per student and handle the sorts of immersive learning experiences that students expect, and not just in, you know, at every school, not just in the schools that you know, people can afford an unlimited data connection. And I will say the FCC has made great strides, particularly for schools and libraries, in their E-rate modernization, allowing for Category 2 funds to be spent on internal connections, so particularly on Wi-Fi. And since 2014, libraries have taken advantage of those funds at an incredible rate, and schools have as well, because it's the internal connections that matter just as much as getting those T1 lines or fiber, sorry, to the schools and the libraries themselves.
Yeah, now that's a great point, because it's almost it's sort of for community anchors, the mirror image of the point the cable industry often makes is that, okay, it used to be that the home broadband bottleneck was the connectivity to the house itself, right? Because people were only getting, you know, whatever it was, 20, 50, 100, and Wi-Fi, even N, you know, when we used to talk about 802.11, ABCD, you know, could distribute 250 megabits. But now, I think most of the cable companies have made homes gigabit ready, but Wi-Fi can no longer distribute a gigabit of well, it never could distribute a gigabit of connectivity around the home, and that's got to be much worse in a school or a library, right?
Right, and thanks for mentioning the G word, the gigabit word. I think that is a word that people understand. The 160 megahertz channels are the path to gigabit wireless connectivity at a cost that is affordable for communities, community anchor institutions, and consumers. Like that's what's exciting. And when we're throwing around megahertz and gigahertz, it's what people will experience and soon that I think is truly exciting. It's always a good day when you can talk about spectrum and Wi-Fi and libraries. So that's why I'm so excited. But it truly is exciting.
Any other comments on importance for digital divide or? Pardon? Yeah, let me do that because I'm.
Because you're bored of us?
Yeah, that's right. I'm going to just go further in the weeds if we keep on like this. So, just in order to stop me, please, this would be a great opportunity for y'all to ask any questions, and I actually am brave enough to take comments. But tell us who you are, at least. Yes, Paul.
Jean is coming with the microphone.
Thanks. So Chairman Pai said that one of the benefits of a clean, simple divide between the two services is that it would render unnecessary long multi-year testing that would have been necessary if you went with a co-channel solution. So can you talk a little bit about why that speed is important, why we need to do this earlier rather than wait another 2 years to make that happen, and what do you make of that that benefit of making this simpler and not having to have the co-channel testing?
I think a lot of this has to do with the deployment of 5G networks that's going on right now in communities across the country. 5G and Wi-Fi are complementary, and as we're building these new networks and people are adding new devices that will connect to the networks, they have to have a way to connect in massive amounts of in massive quantities. So having this move forward quickly enables those devices to get on board as the 5G networks are being deployed. So with the two services being complementary, it's really important to move quickly on enabling unlicensed use as well as deploying the 5G networks.
Thanks for the question, Paul. The reason why WISPA thinks this is really important is because as 5G technologies develop, rural areas don't want to be left behind. And our WISPA member operators don't want their communities left behind. So if they can develop together and we can have this contiguous spectrum, that's, folks can be working on developing solutions and equipment for rural areas. That's really exciting to WISPA and the communities they serve.
I would just add in that because I think, again, some folks who maybe haven't been paying close attention to the saga of 5.9 gigahertz over the past 3 years is that what the Commission's been, and DOT jointly have been doing is testing, sharing. Literally it was what the Commission spent and DOTs together spent more than a year doing was bench testing, just phase one of a 3-phase testing process to whether Wi-Fi could detect and avoid DSRC. So that was the idea, is that even though auto safety signaling would only take 20 or 30 megahertz at the most, the idea was, well, God, we don't want to take any spectrum away from these guys, so you're going to have to detect and avoid them over 75 megahertz. And they've just run that into a testing rut. And so really, I mean, part of the, if any reporters are still here, you should realize that part of the, between the lines, part of the news that Chairman Pai made today was that this isn't sharing between autos and Wi-Fi. This is band segmentation. So the lower portion, apparently, from what I understood the chairman say, will be unlicensed, meaning equal sharing. Obviously, auto applications will use it, in-car infotainment, because most people aren't going to be otherwise on Wi-Fi as you're driving down the road, because Wi-Fi has to connect to an external network. I mean, you could with cellular probably, but for the most part, it can be used equally. But the whole point here, in a way, is, or part of the win, we hope, is that, in answer to Paul's question, is that there will be no more further need for phase 2 and phase 3 of testing something that would destroy the contiguity of that spectrum with Uni 3, with the band just below, and hence Ellen's wording in contiguous. You have immediately a 160 megahertz channel that can give you near gigabit throughput, hopefully with the Uni 3 rules, which are robust, which is the most robust Wi-Fi.
Hi, John Windhausen, Shelby Coalition. So I haven't followed this as closely as I wish I had, but a couple of months ago there was a letter from the Department of Transportation to the FCC telling them to take it off of the agenda because of this dispute. Now, does Chairman Pai's announcement today resolve the controversy with the Department of Transportation? So is this now going to go through, or is DOT still going to raise problems?
I don't know, John. I think you should ask Secretary Chow. No. I mean,
You're
I don't
allocating, he said he's going to allocate 10 megahertz for either DSRC or CVTX. So does that, what the Department of Transportation needed to see was that there's some bandwidth that DSRC could continue to use? Does that resolve it?
I think we don't know, but I'm brave enough to read some tea leaves, which is that back in May when Chairman Pai originally announced that this would be on the June agenda, he described it as being more like a notice of inquiry. You know, it was going to be a further notice, but we were going to ask questions about all the different scenarios, detect and avoid, et cetera. And now it seems like a very done deal. And whether that means that deal has been done with DOT or not, I don't know. I actually hope so. I mean, that would be the smart thing, because if they're not bringing back the mandate for either DSRC or CB2X, and even if they do, what Chairman Pai described would mean they sensibly are trying to harmonize with Europe, which is using 30 for both DSRC and CB2X, then this seems to kind of give everybody a piece while optimizing the benefits for consumers.
Hi, Jeff Wessling, our Street Institute. We think about unlicensed. We normally think, Wi-Fi, the existing technologies that are already there, but anyone can access this spectrum. So do you think we might see altogether new technologies that needed this wider channel that we haven't even thought of yet that might come in and really make disruptive competition in those bands?
Absolutely. I don't think we're going to know what technology is going to evolve from an expanded Wi-Fi, but I'm sure people are looking at it and they're thinking, well, what if I do this? This will be a great use of that unlicensed spectrum.
And just to piggyback on what Deb was saying, I mean, that's the history of Wi-Fi, right? This was an experiment in quote unquote junk bands, and look where we've gotten in 20 years. I think there are very, very smart people out there with like an independent streak who are absolutely looking at what they can do next. And you see it in some apps that activate radios, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like not theoretical, it is a thing.
Yeah, and having huge...
You can do it in libraries. Sorry.
And having huge contiguous bands, the ability to spread bits, maybe at very low power, I mean, that could, by itself, not being an engineer, I can't imagine many of the options, but that by itself could be one thing that spurs a lot of new innovation. So this is kind of refilling the sandbox for innovators. I like that one. Yeah, so any other questions, comments right now? Because okay, you're going to be sorry. I'll go back and ask just a couple more questions then. Rather than end too early, right? Let you off the hook, because we have a couple.
Because nobody else has a day job.
We have a couple more important ones, and then we'll end. early based on the schedule. But but I did want to get back to Louis about how WISPs use this, because this persistent rural divide, and quite honestly, cellular 5G is not getting out to these less populated, low ARPU areas anytime soon. So although WISPs are typically focused on rural areas, in the 6 gigahertz proceeding, WISP has asked the FCC to adopt higher power operations, not just for rural, but for urban areas too. So why is WISPO concerned about, kind of a harmonization of some of these
Paragraph 79 of the 2018 NPRM.
Okay. I hope you have more than that.
Well, so in that paragraph, the commission asked, should we, allow higher power in rural areas, and didn't ask about urban areas. And a lot of the commenters that answered that question, except for us, a lot of the commenters said, yeah, the FCC should definitely allow higher power in rural areas, and did not bother to say, and also in urban areas. But for WISPs, it's really important that the equipment manufacturer ecosystem, because our members are so small, and their annual revenues are not in the billions and not in the 100 millions for most of them, 90% of them, they really need the entire equipment manufacturer ecosystem to work, to build devices that, base stations, APs, what have you, client devices that will be able to take advantage of the 1200 megahertz of spectrum. And that would just do tremendous for them being able to provide robust 5G services and applications to their consumers, but then also to broaden their coverage so that they can acquire and provide 5G services to more rural Americans.
Okay, and then one more loose end from me. I just want to double back to Ian and Deb probably, but definitely Ian, who mentioned automated vehicles. And Chairman Pai really emphasized that the commission remains very committed to giving the auto industry what it needs for auto safety. And so automated vehicles, although they may take longer than many hope, they're certainly in our future, using LiDAR and other technologies. So to what extent are those technologies dependent on spectrum, 5.9 or otherwise? I mean, how is this kind of fit into a larger context when you look at it from an automotive perspective as well?
Well, I mean, I think that's actually the good news here, and that is, when it comes to auto safety, the ultimate answer is going to be humans taking less of a direct role in the way that vehicles operate. And the most advanced systems that are under development today, some that you see rolling around down in Arizona, that Waymo has on the ground, those systems are not terribly dependent in any way on Wi-Fi or on spectrum. There are going to be all kinds of synergistic applications, as Jeff from our street points out, that could be realized, and that's fantastic. But our safety future is not dependent on it, and not on 5.9 in particular when it comes to automated vehicles. And as you say, they're a little further out, but the fact is level 3 vehicles are not all that far out, and more sophisticated technologies that might, well, I hope, will address many of our safety, environmental, congestion, equity concerns are, I don't know, they're certainly in our lifetime.
Okay, so turn back to the audience for any last questions or comments. Otherwise, we can probably wrap early, but I don't want to press you not to ask.
I don't have a question.
Okay.
I just wanted to thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you, Michael, and the panel for your comments. We'll be happy to stick around and answer any other questions. And Evan, please thank the chairman again for joining us today and for this great announcement. Thank you all.